So in my presentation, I will first set out 9 theological principles that define the Christian view of matter, 1a, 2a, etc., and critically assess them, 1b, 2b, etc. Then at the end, I will attempt to draw conclusions on the nature of matter, appealing to some of the greatest thinkers, whether they fall into the Christian tradition or not. So first, the theological principles defining the Christian view of matter, 1a. The first theological principle is that matter is not eternal in the sense that there was a point of creation when matter came into being. Although there is nothing explicit about a creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, in the New Testament, already in the 2nd century, theologians were affirming the idea, often appealing to Genesis chapter 1. Although creation out of nothing denies the eternity of matter, there is a sense in which Christian theologians have viewed matter as eternal, in that it is transformed in the world to come. See point 9 below. 1b. We immediately face the issue that questions of matter are tied up with those of space and time. The Bible generally has a mythical view of matter, space, and time. And although such a mythical view of the world has been harnessed by some of the greatest artists to disclose the mysteries of the world, we also face the challenge of relating this to a scientific worldview. The moment of the creation of matter could be related to the Big Bang model based on Einstein's general relativity. However, Hartle and Hawking, in taking account of the quantum origin of the universe, argue that one cannot speak of any moment of creation, a t equals 0, since as one goes back in time, the temporal dimension becomes spatial. The specific idea of a creation out of nothing has been contested both within and without the Christian tradition. Arthur Schopenhauer, an agnostic, who was nevertheless influenced by Christian theology, argued for the imperishability of matter, and that nothing comes out of nothing, and nothing can again become nothing. An opposing view can be found in Schopenhauer's bête noire, Hegel, who argued against nothing comes out of nothing. And the issue as to whether matter came out of nothing was fundamental, of course, for the cosmological argument for the existence of God. 2a. The second principle is the goodness of creation, again found in Genesis 1. Throughout this chapter, it is stressed that God creates a world that is good. There were, of course, traditions that questioned this goodness of creation, the obvious example being Gnosticism, whereby matter was understood as fundamentally evil, the world being created not by God, but by a demiurge. Although Christian orthodoxy has generally stressed the goodness of creation, the mythical view of Genesis 1-3 does not imply that Adam and Eve were created immortal. Rather, they were offered the opportunity for immortality via the tree of life, Genesis 2:9. Once they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, they no longer had access to the tree of life and therefore lost the opportunity for immortality. Hence, sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin. That's Romans 5, verse 12. 2b. The idea of a good creation has been questioned throughout the Christian era, and this has become especially acute since Darwin. To appreciate this, consider Calvin, who would appear to be largely right in understanding Isaiah's prophecy that the wolf shall live with the lamb, Isaiah 11:6, to imply that animal predation was a result of the fall. But by the beginning of the 19th century, it was widely believed that there was animal predation before human beings emerged, And Darwin, stressing suffering and death as mechanisms of natural selection, intensified the theological problem of a good creation. 3a. This then brings us to the third principle, that of the fall of humankind. However, there have been several ways of interpreting such a fall. In the Western tradition, i.e. Catholic and Protestant traditions, this fall has been seen as a catastrophic event having disastrous consequences which can only be rectified by Christ's atoning death. The main source for such a fall is Paul of Tarsus, and an extreme version of his theology led to Gnosticism. According to the Pauline version of Christianity, the world of matter and minds stands under a curse. However, although this is the dominant view in Western Christianity, the Eastern tradition gives a very different picture, having no doctrine of original sin. 3b. The very idea of a fall, like the idea of a good creation, has been challenged, especially since Darwin. Nevertheless, this is a powerful myth that addresses fundamental existential issues, including those relating to the material world, so disease, suffering, and death. And I believe Christian theology is impoverished if such a myth is simply dismissed. A positive reception of the myth entails being embedded in the reality of the myth, a participation in the life of Adam, as Paul would put it. 4a. The fourth principle is the Incarnation. God becoming a human being radically changes how matter is to be understood. As John 1:14 expresses it, the word became flesh, Zargs. This makes the Christian religion distinctive. It also makes Christian theology extremely complex. The idea of God becoming a human being has given rise to an endless discussion as to how his divinity is to be related to his humanity. And of course, Christian theologians have spent some time and effort in discussing the related idea of the Trinity. 4b. The Incarnation is, of course, highly contested in interreligious dialogue. Further, even within the Christian tradition, many have questioned or rejected it. Some of the debates have centered around the virginal conception and raised questions about the nature of matter. My own reading of the New Testament texts that mention the virginal conception, that's Matthew 1-2 and Luke 1-2, is that the Creator, Holy Spirit, creates an embryo out of nothing in Mary's womb, hence making her a surrogate mother. In view of the fact that the earliest texts of the New Testament are silent on the virginal conception, and in view of the theological problems involved in such a conception, not least in relation to modern ideas of embryology, I'm now coming to the view that Jesus most likely had a normal conception. That a human being having a natural conception could be divine clearly goes against many preconceptions of what God should be like. However, some of the New Testament witnesses clearly had no problem with this, and the very definition of God appears to have changed in view of the Christ events. One of the central messages of the first part of Hegel's Science of Logic, the doctrine of being, is that for something to be real, it has to include the negative. And this will be important for the death of God, 6b below. 5a. The fifth principle is the efficacy of sacraments, and as a Protestant, I consider just baptism and communion. God becoming a human being can entail the changing of the very status of matter. A figure such as Zwingli is an exception to this view. He separated Christ's humanity and divinity, and this led to his seeing the bread and wine in communion as mere symbols. Opposing Zwingli, Luther held to Christ's bodily presence in the communion. This was rooted in his view that the divinity and humanity of Christ were not to be divided, and that the divinity and humanity of Christ participate in each other, the so-called communicatio idiomatum. Since Christ as divine is omnipresent, the same must be said of Christ's human body. Although Luther held to the real presence of Christ in the communion, he opposed worshipping the host, i.e. the bread that's consecrated. The Roman Catholic tradition, arguably taking a more consistent view, held to both the real presence and the worshipping of the host. For example, you see the priest genuflecting before the host, or the congregation worshipping the host in the service of benediction. No doubt this is seen as idolatry by those in other religious traditions, but it seems inescapable that if one holds to the Incarnation, matter must have achieved a completely new status. And we see this not only in relation to communion, but also in baptism. 5b. The issues of communion and baptism became a fundamental point of contention in Christian theology. One of the most celebrated ways of understanding the communion was that of transubstantiation, based on Aristotle's distinction between substance and accidents. The issue of substance is involved, and I intend to deal with this in detail when it comes to the published version of this talk. But for now, I raise the issue whether it makes any sense to speak of substance. The term comes from substara, to stand under, the corresponding Greek term for substratum being to hypokemenon, from hypokemai, I stand under. The issue of such a substrate crops up in many places, sometimes unexpectedly. For example, Stephen Hawking writes in his bestseller, even if there is only one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? But one could take the view that one should not be concerned with what matter is, but simply with what it does. A view of a substrate that may cohere with both Christian theology and modern physics is that of Kant's thing in itself. The categories of accidents and substance could then be replaced by those of appearance and thing in itself, or phenomena and noumena. So eating bread in the phenomenal world could correspond to feeding on Christ in the noumenal world. This is just a suggestion. 6a. The sixth principle is the redemption achieved through the death of Jesus Christ. Again, there have been several ways of understanding this, one of the most powerful being Christ's death as a sacrifice in which believers participate. And this is related to the communion, whereby believers eat his flesh and drink his blood. So that is how it's put in John chapter 6, 22 to 59. The redemptive death of Jesus has material consequences, one of which is that those in Christ are free from the law of Moses. According to Paul of Tarsus, this means that they are free from the condemnation that comes from the law of Moses. Further, they do not even have to keep many of the laws of Moses, for example, the food laws. 6b. An obvious problem of the myth of Jesus' sacrifice is how the shedding of his blood and his death can lead to the redemption of humankind. And how is such a redemption related to the realm of matter? The New Testament mythology works with the interpenetration of the material and the ideal. Such a mythical worldview is at odds with most post-Cartesian philosophy. Hence, many have attempted to demythologize the redemption in Jesus Christ, one of the most famous being that of Bultmann in his existential interpretation. An earlier attempt at demythologizing can be found in Hegel. So he discusses the picture thinking. So the terms are Vorstellen or Vorstellung. So he talks about the picture thinking of religious discourse and argues for a transition to absolute knowing as he moves from chapter 7 to chapter 8 of the Phenomenology. The irony is that his discussion of so-called absolute knowing is full of picture thinking and raises the issue as to whether one can dispose of picture thinking in philosophy. But the point I want to highlight is his idea of the death of God. For him, Christianity is the absolute religion because it involves a God who embraces the negative. So God is not Kant's ens realissimum, the most real thing, but is a God who dies on Good Friday. But that is not the final word, since God is now at work in human hearts. How this relates to the world of matter is unclear and is more a theme for tomorrow's session on spirit. 7a. The seventh principle is the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. All the major Christian traditions hold that the earthly body of Jesus was transformed into a heavenly body, and this obviously has implications for the understanding of matter. Luke Acts, which I take to be a late first century work, introduces a two-stage resurrection and ascension. However, the earliest New Testament traditions suggest a one-stage resurrection exaltation. So that's what you got in Philippians 2, verses 9 to 11. According to New Testament writers, Jesus appeared to various witnesses after his death, and the Gospels relate stories of an empty tomb. The resurrection of Jesus is understood as an anticipation of the general resurrection of believers. There's 1 Corinthians 15, 12 to 58, and C9a below. 7b. I hold to the position that there are grounds for believing Jesus' followers experienced his presence after his death. The grounds for holding to an empty tomb, though, are more challenging. If there were to be an empty tomb, then it does demonstrate God's commitment to redeem the material world. So see point 9 below. (8a). An eighth principle is that Christian theology has generally opposed a view of materialism, namely that the only thing that exists is matter. Further, many have held the view that there is an interpenetration between matter and mind, matter and spirit, etc. This is very much related to the mythical view of the world presented in the New Testament. Here we read of Jesus healing the sick, by prayer, and even by exorcism. 8b. One of the ironies of the Enlightenment is that in its stress on reason, this involving criticism and a search for explanation, there arose a skepticism about the very existence of a material world. The problem was addressed by German idealists in their various ways. I maintain that one of the strengths of Christian theology is its rejection of materialism. I would further maintain that Christian theology can develop a view of the interpenetration of matter and mind, as I will shortly explain. 9a. The ninth principle is that of eschatology, the doctrine of the last things. Traditionally, eschatology has been concerned with those four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. The doctrine of heaven has serious implications for the understanding of matter, since it is seen as a realm of transformed matter. 9b. In personal conversations, it is the issue of eschatology that have so often acted as a stumbling block. A friend of mine who counts himself as a Christian said after the death of his wife that Paul of Tarsus had overreached himself in writing of the resurrection of the body. Then there is the teaching of the second coming of Jesus Christ, seen as a reversal of the ascension related in Acts chapter 1, and both of which are difficult to conceptualize. Yet if the Christian teaching on heaven is true, then we do have a remarkable instance of God redeeming the material world. And we can think of this also in relation to the empty tomb. Conclusions on the nature of matter. I've already set out some ideas as to how the Christian tradition can deal with the issue of matter, and I now draw together the threads. One reason I have appealed to Kant and Hegel is not only because they produce some of the greatest philosophical works ever, but also because their thinking coheres with aspects of modern physics. But the challenge is that on certain issues their thought is irreconcilable. And it is no coincidence that Kant coheres in many respects with quantum theory and Hegel with relativity, these also being two theories that are likewise difficult to reconcile. Two ways of bringing these theories together are loop quantum gravity and string theory, both of which in turn are irreconcilable. How do I bring together the best in Kant and Hegel will be addressed elsewhere. But here I simply outline key elements in their thought that reach to the heart of the mystery of the world. For me, one of Hegel's greatest insights is the death of God in Jesus Christ, the result being that God is now at work in human hearts. The problem, though, is that his philosophy leads many of his interpreters to hold that the only life one has is this one. By contrast, it is the non-Christian theist Kant and the agnostic Schopenhauer who have a philosophical perspective that coheres with many aspects of Christian theology. For both philosophers, matter is a mind-dependent entity. If we remove all subjects from the world, that's going to be humans, cats, dogs, grasshoppers, etc., there would be no matter. You could say if God creates the noumena, human and animal subjects create the phenomena, the world of matter. The challenging idea of the new earth and new heaven of Revelation 21 can then be understood as a new phenomenal world. And if the body is understood as a manifestation of the soul in the phenomenal world, then the resurrection of the body could be understood as a new manifestation of the soul of the noumenal realm, where space, time, and causation do not apply. All this ultimately depends on whether one can speak of a thing in itself. Shortly after Kant published his Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, the idea was attacked by three figures who were to develop idealism in a new direction, namely Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. I do not wish to underestimate the power of their arguments against the idea of Kant's thing in itself. However, 100 years after their attack on Kant's subjective idealism, there arose a theory that I believe coheres with Kant's scheme, namely quantum theory. According to some interpretations of quantum theory, matter is a representation. It comes about because subjects interact with a world that is describable by mathematical functions. We have a process of what is called decoherence, whereby wave functions collapse to render the matter we experience. Matter is not solid or impenetrable, it only appears that way. And with quantum theory, the world begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. This year, we celebrate the centenary of Heisenberg's matrix mechanics and next year's Schrödinger's wave mechanics. Their work and that of their many collaborators has transformed the way we understand matter. Research into such matters must prove to be one of the greatest enterprises of humanity. But if we are to attempt to understand the world of matter, I think the Christian theologian has a fundamental contribution to make. Informed by Scripture, by philosophy, by art in its widest sense, and by science, the theologian has the capacity to plumb the mysteries of the world. And one of the key insights, I think, is that matter can only be understood in the light of mind, and mind can only be understood in the light of God, however such a being or spirit is understood. Thank you.